In the small, windswept coastal town of Kaikoura on New Zealand's South Island, George Whitmore lived a life measured in brushstrokes and the slow rhythm of the tides. At 67, he was a man carved from solitude, his days spent in the quiet sanctuary of his workshop, a converted garage that smelled of linseed oil and aged wood. He was a restorer of art, though these days he mostly repaired antique furniture for local bed and breakfasts or touched up faded family portraits. The work was honest and kept his hands busy, which was what he needed most. His mind, if left idle, would drift to the empty armchair by the fireplace, the one that had belonged to his wife Sarah. 10 years had passed since the cancer took her, but the silence she left behind was as vast as the Pacific Ocean that crashed against the nearby shore. His only true companion was a golden retriever named Tue, whose heavy head would often rest on George's knee as he worked, a warm presence in the cold house. George was a man of few words and deep routines. Each morning, he would make a single cup of tea, feed Tue, and then walk to the shed. But before any task, he would perform a quiet ritual, walking to the small dust-free shelf above his workbench and gazing at the painting that hung there. The painting was a modest oil landscape, no bigger than a sheet of legal paper, depicting the rocky coastline just south of town. The waves were painted with a loving but untrained hand, the colors slightly too vivid, the perspective slightly off. To any art dealer, it was a sentimental amateur piece worth perhaps $50 for the frame. To George Whitmore, it was worth everything. It was the last thing Sarah had ever painted, a gift for their 30th anniversary, completed just weeks before her diagnosis. It held the light of her eyes, the touch of her hand, the very essence of the woman he had loved for half a century. It was, in every way that mattered, his soul committed to canvas. That autumn evening started like any other. George had spent the afternoon varnishing a restored oak table. As the light began to fade, casting long purple shadows across his yard, he packed up his tools and walked the familiar path to his house. He pushed open the back door, calling out Tue's name, expecting the usual excited scramble of claws on the wooden floor. Instead, there was only a profound, unsettling silence. A cold draft seeped from the hallway, and George felt a prickle of unease travel up his spine. He walked through the kitchen and into the living room. His heart seized in his chest. The room was in disarray. Drawers were pulled out, their contents scattered on the rug. Cushions from the sofa were tossed aside. But George barely registered the mess. His eyes shot immediately to the wall above the fireplace, to the clean, light-colored rectangle of wallpaper where the rest of the room had faded around it. The space was bare. The painting was gone. He stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the blood roaring in his ears. The violation of his home was a distant second to the gaping void on the wall. It was as if someone had reached into his chest and removed a piece of his heart. He stumbled to the phone and called the local police station. The responding officer was a young woman named Constable Miller, who seemed more annoyed at being called out on a quiet evening than concerned. She took notes with a placid expression as George, his voice trembling, described the stolen item, a small oil painting of the coast, unsigned, of no commercial value. She looked at the disarray, the open window in the spare bedroom, and nodded sympathetically. "I'll file the report, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone kind but dismissive. "But between us, these things rarely get solved unless they turn up at a pawn shop. With no serial number and little monetary value, it's not a high priority." After she left, George sat in the dark, Tue finally creeping out from under the bed to rest his head on his master's lap. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful, it was suffocating. In the days that followed, a profound despair settled over George. He went through the motions of living, but his world had dimmed. He would find himself walking into the workshop and staring at the empty shelf, expecting to see the painting, only to be crushed anew by its absence. He placed ads in the local paper and visited every second-hand store within 100 kilometers, but no one had seen the painting. He was a ghost haunting his own life. 2 weeks after the burglary, a desperate idea brought him to the public library, a place he rarely visited. A kind librarian named Helen, who knew everyone's troubles, showed him how to search online auction sites. He sat awkwardly in front of the glowing screen, his thick fingers clumsy on the keyboard. He typed in vague searches for New Zealand landscape paintings, scrolling through page after page of images, feeling hopeless. Then, he stopped breathing. On the screen was an image that made his vision blur. It was her painting. The rocky coastline, the vivid almost too blue sea, the crooked horizon. It was unmistakable. He clicked on the listing. It was for a prestigious fine art auction house in Sydney, Australia. The painting was listed as Lot 47, early 20th century Australian expressionist landscape, attributed to the Heidelberg School influence. The estimated selling price was between $250,000 and $350,000 Australian dollars. And the consignor, the person selling the piece, was listed as the Whitmore Contemporary Gallery, operating out of the exclusive Paddington district in Sydney. George stared at the name of the gallery. Whitmore. A cold, terrible understanding began to dawn on him, an understanding far more painful than the initial burglary. He knew only one person in the world who would use that name in such a context. Julian. His son. The name had been a ghost in the Whitmore house for nearly 2 decades. Julian had left Kaikoura at 20, after a series of ferocious arguments with his father. Julian had wanted to be an artist, to move to a city and study, to be discovered. George, a practical man who understood the value of honest work and the cruelty of a world that chews up the untalented, had tried to dissuade him. He told Julian he didn't have the gift. The words, meant to be a protective warning, had been received as a brutal judgment. Julian had accused his father of jealousy, of wanting to keep him trapped in a dead-end town, of never believing in him. Sarah had tried to mediate, but the rift had been too deep. Julian had left one night without a goodbye, and for 18 years, there had been only silence. No phone calls, no letters. George had heard rumors from a traveling salesman years ago that Julian was in Sydney, working in an art gallery. He had felt a flicker of pride, quickly extinguished by the old hurt. But this was something else entirely. George sat in the library, trembling. He zoomed in on the image of the painting, his eyes tracing the familiar strokes. It was Sarah's. His wife's. And his son, his own flesh and blood, was selling it as a fraudulent masterpiece, erasing his mother's memory to line his own pockets. The betrayal was a physical blow. The police wouldn't help him now, the crime had crossed an international border, and the painting was now an asset listed by a respected gallery. He was just a retired restorer from a small town. Who would believe him against the sophisticated owner of a successful Sydney art gallery? He stared at the screen. He could either let Julian get away with it, or he could do something desperate. For the first time in a decade, George Whitmore felt something other than grief. He felt a cold, hard fury. 3 weeks later, George Whitmore stepped out of a taxi onto a tree-lined street in Paddington, Sydney. He felt like an alien who had landed on a foreign planet. Kaikoura was all rugged coast and quiet, friendly faces. Here, the air was thick with expensive coffee and car exhaust. The people were sleek, well-dressed, and moved with purpose. He was staying in a small cheap hotel room in King's Cross. He had withdrawn almost all of his savings. His plan was vague, born of desperation rather than strategy. He needed to get into the Whitmore Contemporary Gallery, see the painting with his own eyes, and find a way to prove it was his. He found the gallery easily. It was a stunning space with a gleaming white facade, large windows displaying abstract sculptures. He stood across the street, feeling foolish in his best button-down shirt. He watched as elegant people walked in and out. Taking a breath, he crossed the street and pushed open the door. A small bell chimed. The interior was cool, quiet, and intimidating. A young woman with a severe haircut looked up. Her smile was professional and instantly assessing. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" George cleared his throat. "I'm interested in the painting. The landscape. The one in the upcoming auction." The receptionist's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, lot 47. A beautiful piece. Are you a registered bidder?" George faltered. "I just wanted to see it. In person." The receptionist glanced at his shoes, then back at his face. "I'm afraid the piece is in storage until the pre-auction viewing, which is by invitation only." Before George could stammer a reply, the heavy door to the back office opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, with styled hair and an easy confident smile. George's breath caught in his throat. It was Julian. His son. 18 years had changed him. The angry, skinny young man was gone, replaced by a polished, handsome stranger. Julian's eyes swept the room, landing on George for a fraction of a second before sliding away without a flicker of recognition. Why would he recognize him? George had aged, his face weathered by grief. Julian was seeing a shabby, confused old man. Julian spoke briefly to the receptionist and then walked out, flashing a meaningless social smile at George. George stood frozen. The son who had ignored him for nearly 2 decades had just looked right through him. He left the gallery in a daze and found a small park nearby. The encounter had solidified his resolve. The polished, successful man he had just seen was a stranger. His mother was erased from that man's world, reduced to a commodity to be faked and sold. He needed an ally, someone who understood this world of champagne and lies. His opportunity came the next day. He was back across the street from the gallery when he saw a young woman arguing with the receptionist on the sidewalk. The young woman was holding a tablet, gesturing angrily at the gallery window. "It's a deliberate misattribution, and you know it," she was saying. The receptionist just smirked and walked back inside. George approached her cautiously. "Excuse me," he said. The woman turned, her expression still flushed with anger. She was in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back. "I couldn't help overhearing," George continued. "You said something about a misattribution. I'm interested in that painting." The woman, whose name was Elena, sighed. "The Whitmore Gallery has a reputation for creative attributions. They take unknown pieces and attach famous names to inflate the price." George took a deep breath. This was his chance. "My name is George Whitmore," he said. Elena's eyes widened at the surname. "I'm Julian's father. And that painting was painted by my wife Sarah 30 years ago in our kitchen in New Zealand. Julian stole it from my house." The confession hung in the air. Elena stared. "You're joking," she whispered. George shook his head. "I need your help to prove it." A slow, determined smile spread across Elena's lips. "Mr. Whitmore, I think we just became partners." Over the next few days, Elena became George's guide. She explained that proving the painting's origin would require forensic proof: a tiny fiber from the canvas, a microscopic flake of paint. The pre-auction viewing was in 3 days. It was their only chance to get George physically close to the painting. Elena got him an invitation through a contact. The plan was risky. George would attend the viewing posing as a wealthy collector. Once inside, he needed to extract a sample. The night arrived. George walked into the gallery, now transformed into a glittering event. Champagne flutes glinted. And there on the main wall was Sarah's painting, spotlit like a masterpiece. George moved toward it, his heart hammering. He was halfway across the room when he saw Julian holding court with elegantly dressed people. George averted his gaze and continued. He stopped before the painting, pretending to study it. He could see the familiar brushstrokes. He glanced around. The security guard was by the door. He took a small step closer, his hand moving to his pocket where Elena had placed a small sample kit. He leaned in. Then a voice behind him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" George turned slowly. Julian was standing right there, a champagne flute in his hand, a polite, curious smile on his face. "One of the finest pieces we've ever handled," Julian continued. George mumbled agreement. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Have we met? You look familiar." George's blood ran cold. "I don't think so. I'm from New Zealand. Just visiting." Julian nodded slowly, but the assessing look remained. "Enjoy the viewing." He moved away, but George could feel his son's eyes on his back. He had lost his chance. He slipped away and found Elena outside. "Did you get it?" she whispered. George shook his head. "He almost recognized me. We need another plan." Elena found a new angle. The painting would be moved from the gallery to the auction house the night before the sale. It would be in the back storage room for a few hours being crated. Elena knew someone on the cleaning crew who could get them in. 2 nights later, at 11 p.m., George and Elena slipped through a service door. The storage room was cold and organized. And there, on a central table, was Sarah's painting. George moved quickly. With the precision of a surgeon, he used tweezers to pluck a microscopic fiber from the canvas edge. Then with a sterile blade, he scraped a tiny fleck of blue paint from an unobtrusive spot. They slipped out. The samples went to a forensic chemist at the University of Sydney. 2 days later, Dr. Anya Sharma delivered the results. The canvas fiber is a blend not available in Australia until 1985. The blue pigment is phthalocyanine bluebius, developed in the 1930s and not common in artists' paints until the 1950s. There is no scientific possibility this painting was created before 1950. George had his proof. They sent the forensic report, photos of George with the painting in his old house, and the police report of the burglary to every major art critic and journalist in Sydney, and to the auction house. The morning of the auction, George and Elena waited across the street. They watched bidders file inside. They saw Julian arrive, confident in a dove-gray suit. At 10:55 a.m., they saw commotion near the hotel entrance. The auction house's legal counsel rushed inside. Moments later, journalists pushed past the doorman. Through the windows, they saw the auctioneer stop mid-sentence. The legal counsel whispered urgently to him. The auctioneer announced something. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Julian. His confident smile vanished. Journalists surrounded him. George watched his son's world collapse. Julian's eyes scanned the room and then through the glass, locked onto George across the street. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other. Julian's expression was a mix of hatred, disbelief, and something like shame. George did not smile. He simply held his son's gaze. The auction was halted. The painting was seized. Julian was arrested for fraud. Weeks later, George returned to Kaikoura, the painting wrapped carefully in his old coat. As his plane lifted over the coast, he looked out at the ocean below. He thought of Sarah, and for the first time in years, the memory brought a faint peaceful smile. The painting was going home. And so was he.